I'm proud about the National Health Service. It's a piece of real socialism.
Whilst I'm sure we would all prefer to be together under one roof, it's great to have so many of you remotely joining in with us, as it's sure to be a fantastic event. I'll run through tonight's event momentarily, but first, let me introduce the speakers. It's with great pleasure that I introduce the man who literally has written a book on Nye Bevan, our Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas-Symonds. Nick has been an MP for Torvine since 2015 and was appointed Shadow Home Secretary in April this year. Our second speaker is Councillor Terry Einan. Terry is the Labour leader for Leicestershire County Council and is a retired GP, but knows a fair bit about the NHS and also working on the front line. I'm Nicole Duenny, a former councillor at Ashfield District Council and currently one of the women's reps on the East Midlands Regional Board. I am delighted to be your chair this evening, and I hope you enjoy. We'll be kicking off things shortly, but first, just a bit of admin. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through the emergency exits or where the fire exits are, but just to say, wonderful to have so many of you join in with us this evening. And again, we hope you enjoy the talk. The East Midlands Labour Party would like to host more events like these, so please do give us your feedback at the end. We really would appreciate that. This event is not an opportunity, not only an opportunity for our members to meet the new Shadow Home Secretary, but to hear what I'm sure will be a great talk. This is also a fundraising event, so please donate this evening. So right, let's get to the part that you've all been waiting for, including myself. So Nick, I for one, am looking forward to hearing about your Labour hero, Nye Bevan. So take it away, Nick.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole, for that introduction. And as Nicole said, it would be so much nicer to actually be together and to speak to you directly to do this. But nonetheless, I am still very happy to be doing this virtually and grateful to so many of you for coming along this evening with an interest in the great Nye Bevan. Now, in recent weeks, I think we all know we've relied on our National Health Service perhaps more than ever before. And I do want to start by paying tribute to our NHS workers, our care workers, and indeed all our key workers for the way in which they've selflessly looked after others in recent weeks. And say a particular word as well. I know Terry will be speaking about it in due course, but obviously the situation in Leicester, I think the whole country is looking at Leicester and standing with Leicester in what's clearly going to be a continuation of the issues that there have been in recent weeks. So I send my very best wishes to the people of Leicester at this time. Now, over 7 decades since it came into being on the 5th of July 1948, I think we've seen again the position, the very special position that the National Health Service has in our national life. Those Thursday claps for carers, NHS workers, key workers, once again showed that when the country really, really needed help, the National Health Service was there just as it has been for the last 72 years. And tonight, it's a real privilege for me to speak to you about the person who created it, Nye Bevan, and about whom I was so privileged to write a biography and publish back in 2014. And I just want to start really by telling you a story about how I came to write the book. And it came about because when I was still at school, I was in sixth form by then, but I went on a visit to see Michael Foote at his house up in Pilgrims Lane in North London. And I've been doing a piece of history research on Michael. and had written to him without any real sense of what might happen. But he invited me to come to his house. And Michael, being one of my political heroes, this was amazing for me, as you can imagine. And I remember going up to London, going up to Michael Foot's house, knocking on the door, going in, and sitting with him in the sitting room and discussing all the political issues of the day that I was so interested in and so passionate about. And he then said to me that he thought somebody should write a modern day biography of Nye Bevan, because his wonderful 2-volume book published in 1962 and 1973 was obviously by then written some years ago, but also he wanted Nye Bevan's life to be brought to a new audience, a new generation. He said to me, you know, I think you're the person who could write it. Now, as you can imagine, at this point, when my political hero said that to me, I felt on top of the world. However, as I was leaving, Michael's wife, Jill, came up to me and she said, have you had a great conversation with Michael? And I said, yes, you know, it's wonderful. I've had a wonderful afternoon. She said, you do realize, though, don't you, that Michael flatters everybody he meets? And I said, oh, right. She then said, and he works out precisely the best way to flatter them. Now, whether it was flattery or whether it was sincerity, I've never really known. But Michael Foot put the idea into my head to write the biography of Nye Bevan, which I was then delighted some years later to do. And what a privilege and inspiration it was to learn about Nye's life. Now, Nye was born on the 15th of November, 1897. He was the 6th of 10 children. His father, David, was a miner, a Baptist. His mother, Phoebe, was a Methodist. And he started work down the Tea Trist colliery at the age of just 13. And I think there are two things really about Nye's early life that are so significant to the politician he became and so significant to the National Health Service that he created. Because firstly, he had a stammer, which he conquered and spent so much time conquering, and conquered by reciting poetry, reciting Shakespeare. If you ever look at Nye Bevan's speeches, there are lots of quotations in it from literature that came about because of that period when he was trying to conquer the stammer through literature. And there is a great speech by Nye, which is still, I'd recommend you all to listen to it on YouTube if you ever get the chance. And it's the speech that he gave, which really does illustrate the effect of this stammer, on the 4th of November, 1956, in Trafalgar Square in central London, where nearly 30,000 people had gathered to protest against the Conservative government of the day, where the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, had, without United Nations authority, invaded to take possession of the Suez Canal, the Suez Crisis, as it became known. And Anthony Eden had made some rather unwise remarks that although he was acting without United Nations authority, he was actually strengthening it as an institution. And this is what Nye Bevan said in Trafalgar Square in response. He said, Sir Anthony Eden has been pretending that he is now invading Egypt in order to strengthen the United Nations. Every burglar, of course, could say the same thing, argue he was entering the house in order to train the police, and then adopted a mocking tone of Anthony Eden and said, if Sir Anthony is sincere in what he is saying, and he may be, then he's too stupid to be the Prime Minister. And that speech, Bevan's issue was on the letter S. He struggled with words that began with the letter S. By this point in his career, he learned to be able to control the stammer, to actually use it to stress particular words when he was speaking. And the other thing he used to do was to use non-obvious words. So, for example, in that same speech, he couldn't quite, or didn't wish to say that Anthony Eden had sullied the name of Britain. He had to say it was besmirched, because that was the word that he could say very easily. So that conquering of the stammer gave his oratory, I think, gave it colour. It gave him the ability to pause in a particular way, to emphasize certain words, and this tremendously wide vocabulary that infuses all of his speeches. The second significant thing I think about his childhood was the burning sense of injustice that he had. And it was a conclusion that poverty was not inevitable. Poverty was the product of the way Tory governments failed to mobilize the resources of the country. And he said this And it's a sarcastic remark, but it really does sum up how he felt. This is him in May 1945. He said, "This island is made mainly of coal and surrounded by fish. Only an organising genius could produce a shortage of coal and fish at the same time." And that's what he was saying to the Tories. You have failed to mobilise the resources of the country to create an equal society. His father in 1925 died in his arms of pneumoconiosis, which is a disease of dust from working underground on the lungs. And because in those days, the Workmen's Compensation Act, as it was called, published in the late Victorian era in 1897, didn't include that disease on the list of diseases for which you received compensation. So his family was left without income. He watched talented friends emigrate from the country, and he searched for the power to change society, from Tredegar Urban District Council to the Monmouth County Council, and then to Parliament when he was elected for Ebbw Vale in 1929, and then his position as Minister of Health and Housing in government after 1945. And this is what he said. This is him speaking at the Labour Party conference in 1949. He said, "The language of priorities is the religion of socialism. The argument is about power because only by the possession of power can you get the priorities correct." And that had been his journey from the Tredegar Urban District Council right up to holding the levers of government. He was a critic of the wartime coalition, particularly in the early part of the war, because he criticised Winston Churchill for winning debates but not winning battles, and on grounds of what we today would call civil liberties. And it's significant because it made him a hate figure among some figures of the public. And often that part of Nye Bevan's life isn't as obvious as it might be. Often when he went out, and when he went out walking, particularly in that period, it would have been very difficult. He'd sometimes have faced a hostile atmosphere. But he became and was appointed by Clement Attlee as a government minister in 1945. He was very popular with his civil servants because firstly, he had a grand vision of what he wanted to do, and secondly, he was decisive. He made decisions quickly. On housing, by the way, which I'm not talking about so much given the time I have tonight, but he does have a much better record than is often said, particularly given the raw materials crisis and the currency crisis that government faced. He built a lot more houses than he's often given credit for. But his crowning achievement is the National Health Service. And I think when we think of the NHS, we also have to think, what was the situation before it came into being? And before it came into being, the health service was a real patchwork. There were parts of the country that had a decent service. The London County Council, which was led by Herbert Morrison, of course, his cabinet colleague back in the 1930s, treated tens of thousands of patients each year. And of course, there was the Tredegar Medical Aid Society, which local people in Tredegar subscribed to, they paid into. And it did inspire Nye Bevan, not because he wanted a system whereby people paid specific subscriptions. He didn't want that. He wanted something that was paid for out of general taxation. But that model, the idea of people coming together as they did in Tredegar to provide healthcare for everybody, was something that he took onto the national stage. The problem was that not everybody lived in Tredegar. Not everybody in that pre-1948 period had the same level of service. And it was particularly problematic for women because men tended to be the ones who were working, who had actually paid into whatever the particular local system was. So it was a very discriminatory and very partial healthcare system. And therefore, Nye Bevan's vision of the NHS, yes, it is healthcare free at the point of delivery, based on medical need, not your ability to pay, but it is also a universal service. He wanted that standard of service to be available to everybody right across the country. And by the way, don't believe Tory health secretaries when they tell you that it isn't the Nye Bevan's NHS, that somehow it was the Churchill Coalition's health minister, Henry Willink, who deserves the credit. The health service that we have is distinctly a Nye Bevan's, and it's got, in my view, two stamps on it that are very much him. And the first is in terms of the hospitals. Nye wanted to nationalise the hospitals. He believed that the Secretary of State for Health, no devolution in those days, of course, should have as the first duty to provide healthcare, that universal healthcare right across the country. Not everybody wanted to nationalise the hospitals. I mean, Herbert Morrison, who I've already mentioned, because of his experience in the 1930s in the London County Council, thought local authorities should own hospitals. There was a suggestion charities should be allowed to own hospitals, but Nye Bevan won that battle in Cabinet in late 1945 and made sure that the hospitals would be publicly owned, which I think was so important to the NHS going forward. Secondly, he painstakingly negotiated with the British Medical Association. And this really was a game of chess over 18 months. He needed them. You couldn't have a national health service without the doctors. He needed them to come on board with it. They, on the other hand, wanted to come in on certain terms. They knew they couldn't be the people who prevented the National Health Service from happening. But this was extremely difficult. Nye later said that he stuffed their mouths with gold. And yes, he did allow consultants to continue with private work as a compromise, but he very carefully steered those negotiations so that on the 5th of July 1948, he could truly say that he had, and he did say the night before in a speech, the moral leadership of the world in creating this huge, enormous national health service that would bring such benefit. And he did it because he had political courage, he had imagination, he liked to do what he referred to as star-tapping, conversations late into the night as to how he wanted to transform society. And still, the quotation that really does inspire me, that's in his book, In Place of Fear, which he published in the early 1950s, he said this about the kind of country he wanted to create. He said, "Not even the apparently enlightened principle of the greatest good for the greatest number can excuse indifference to individual suffering. There is no test for progress other than its impact on the individual." And if you ask me for one phrase that inspires me in all that Nye Bevan said, it's that one. Don't leave people behind. Be a political party for everyone. Design your policy in such a way that you protect the most vulnerable. And that's at the heart of his book, In Place of Fear. And it's the principle that's at the heart of his National Health Service. It's not about your checkbook. It's not about the size of your bank balance. What determines the treatment you get is your medical need. And it is such an important principle that just didn't exist prior to 1948. And I can't think of another government minister who failed to become prime minister. And indeed, there are some who've become prime minister who don't have anywhere near the scale of Nye Bevan's achievements in that 1945-51 period. Not just the benefit to his own generation of the National Health Service, but the generations of people who've benefited since. I think of recent years. We think of the 2012 London Olympics, that opening ceremony, Danny Boyle's wonderful opening ceremony that had the National Health Service as a part of our national life. And I think that is so important. But the National Health Service isn't just a symbol. It's a living, breathing example of what socialism can do. But it's also, I think, done something far deeper to our politics and far deeper in terms of what people can expect. Because think of the debate over Obamacare in the United States in Barack Obama's first term as president. That was all about freedom. They were talking about the freedom to pay health insurance, whether you had to compulsorily pay it. But here, I think Nye Bevan's impact is he convinced people that an established healthcare is a right, not a luxury. He was saying it is something that you should expect, that if you do become seriously ill, then you can actually have that treatment that you need. You should expect to have it. It shouldn't be just a luxury only available to the very few. And there was a leaflet that went out to every household in the country in 1948 in advance of the NHS coming into being. And it said it will take away your money worries in times of need. And it is precisely that it has done in the 7 or so decades since. But whilst we know that the National Health Service is popular now, underestimate either. There are dangers too. I've spoken about how the world was before 1948, but as time moves on, how it was before 1948 is on the edge of living memory now. Most people who are alive can't remember what it was before then and have only seen the period with the National Health Service. There's a deeply ideological Tory government that is currently in power in Westminster, that given a blank canvas would never create a healthcare system anything like this one. And I think for those of us and everyone on this call and everyone in our Labour movement who believe in the transformational power of the National Health Service, it's Nye Bevan's greatest achievement. It is, in my view, the Labour Party's greatest achievement. What we have to do together is to continue to make the argument for it again and again and again, and never be complacent about our National Health Service. Make the case for our healthcare system as the best model that you can find anywhere in the world. It is literally, I think, the Labour Party's greatest gift to the country. So thank you very much for listening, and let's always fight together to protect our National Health Service.
Thank you so much, Nick. I honestly have learned so much, really. I thought I knew enough, but no, it's always important to do a bit more digging and understand the history and the legacy of Nye Bevan and the NHS. I definitely really loved your point about not leaving people behind. And as a party, that's something we stand on. We cannot leave anyone behind, especially in times like these where we've seen a pandemic. And could we imagine what life in the UK would have been like without the NHS in times like this? Catastrophic. And we must continue to fight to protect it. So I could agree with you completely. But to now introduce our second speaker, Councillor and Dr. Terry Einan, to give us her thoughts and her ideas on the legacy of the NHS creator and also what it's meant to her life and her career. So Terry.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Nick, for an excellent introduction to your book, which I have. I'm now reading, and you're absolutely right. It is now out of memory, but in my family, in 1929, then my grandmother had to leave Blaengarrow, which is the west end of the valleys, because she had TB. And the only way she could get healthcare was when my grandfather got to work for Birmingham City Council. So she had her TB treated at the King's Norton Infectious Diseases Hospital. Unfortunately died before the NHS came into being, but lived longer than she might have done as a result. And this was exactly the kind of situation that people were in then, and we've now forgotten. It's what people in America put up with now, is that all they had was healthcare for those who were in work for working men. But my bit of history starts a bit later than yours, and I'm going to hark back to 2014, to the Oldham report. And Andy Burnham was then the Shadow Health Secretary, and he commissioned Sir John Oldham to write this report. And in the beginning of this, in the introduction, Sir John says, in 2014, the NHS is facing a very different disease challenge from the one that existed at its inception in 1948. Broadly, the main challenge in 1948 was infectious disease. Now it is people with long-term conditions, poor mental health, disabilities, and frailty. Well, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so that paragraph hasn't really worn well, has it? But I think it's still relevant. Back in 2012, I was working for Leicester University, and I was what's called a clinical translation fellow. I was a part-time GP. I'd had experience of setting up mental health services in Leicestershire. And they let me go and try and help what was called the Silver Book team, some of whom still exist and are still battling on the front line in university hospitals of Leicester, a geriatrician, an emergency department consultant, and an academic public health consultant. And our job was to try and implement the British Geriatric Society's flagship campaign document, which was actually written here in Leicestershire. And the aim was to improve care for the frail older people in the NHS. And the New Labour had left the NHS in good shape. we had for many years increased funding. We had the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, which still protects the NHS. The Tories did try to get rid of it as soon as they got into power, but they were told where to go. And a whole load of national service frameworks and targets, which people complain about. But my goodness, you know, when you, as a GP, people were waiting 2 years to have a hip operation, 2 years in pain, during which they then became deconditioned and worse. But there were things that we hadn't sorted. We had continued to export geriatric care to local authorities and from there to the private sector in care homes. There'd been the continuing decline in public health funding and a continuing lack of clarity over NHS and local government responsibilities. So there I was trying to sort things out in the wake, of course, the Health and Social Care Act. Prior to the Health and Social Care Act in Leicestershire, we had 2 primary care trusts who had more or less merged and were actually getting their act together and being quite good. And after that, I had 2 clinical commissioning groups, one in the West, and they wanted to have proactive care, integrated and holistic care wrapped around the patient, they called it. And East Leicestershire and Rutland CCG, they wanted to have integrated care, which was proactive to every patient closer to home. And they wanted entirely different sets of documents. So we gave them the same facts and allowed them to use the slightly different language. It did make success somewhat difficult, all the fragmentation. My post was only funded for a year. And after that, I realised that public health really mattered and decided to have a go. Well, no, I got my arm twisted to stand. You know what AWS stands for in the Labour Party, don't you? Arm twisting women to stand. I was arm twisted to stand for the county council in my hometown of Colville, which is, of course, a former mining community, which had been represented by the British National Party for 4 years, and they were a complete waste of space. And so I got it back for Labour, possibly because people voted me because I used to be their GP, which is usually a good way. So where are we now? Well, we've got COVID-19 and we're in the middle of a pandemic, and what Sir John said about infectious diseases being the past is, yeah, perhaps not over. And we've got an epidemic in care homes, and as has been mentioned, there has been the problems in Leicester City where we've had to continue with the lockdown. And I think that COVID-19 proves that Nye Bevan was absolutely right, because Nye understood that there was an interrelationship between employment, welfare, health, and education. Because health isn't just about medicine. It never was, even when I was a GP. It was always about all those other things. I want to weep when I see on the television people who are struggling to cope in lockdown, living in inadequate accommodation in a damp one-room flat in London, many of them, poor things. And they go, oh, my GP, realise I'm depressed and giving me antidepressants. I'm thinking, it's not antidepressants you actually need, is it? It's decent accommodation. Because healthcare is not just about medicine. And COVID-19 is now spreading in the most disadvantaged communities in this country now today for the same reasons that TB spread in the valleys of Wales in the 1920s, because there was insecure employment. It's a different type of insecurity now, but now we have lower paid workers with multiple jobs, people who can't be furloughed because there wouldn't be a job to go back to. They're living in overcrowded housing. There are many generations sharing too little space. So young people will be going out and perhaps working in the factories, in the towns, and then having to go home to older relatives. There has been a consistent lack of funding for boots on the ground public health in communities whose first language is not English, as my grandfather's village wasn't, and people who, well, they didn't have it in the 1920s, but people who lack access to the internet just don't get to the information they need. COVID-19 then spread in care homes because of a complete disconnect between the NHS and social care, which is what I had been trying to sort out in 2012 and went away with a bruise to my forehead and the determination to continue by other means. A failure to recognise that care homes are healthcare providers, and a failure to send them any personal protective equipment until they'd already had the virus sent to them from the hospitals and brought in from the community to some of our most vulnerable residents. And COVID-19 is now spreading in people and killing people with preventable underlying conditions like diabetes, obesity, which is due to poor nutrition. And of course, the lack of preparedness for a pandemic, which after the Cygnus report, which was the great report in 2016 into what we needed to do to be prepared for a pandemic. I've been waiting for a pandemic ever since I did public health in my lectures as a medical student in the 1980s. We knew one was going to come. We should have been prepared. And we were prepared. In 2009 to 10, the Labour government collected an enormous stockpile of personal protective equipment and put it in a warehouse, and the Tories had it looked after by some private company who has been faffing about looking after their own rent apparently, and didn't rotate the stock. So of course lots of it was out of date. So here we are now, inspired, I hope, by what Nick has been telling us about Nye Bevan. I love Nye Bevan because he, like me, is a pragmatist. He liked power. I like power. It's lovely. You can't do anything without it. And he was someone who knew how to get it, and he knew how to be wily to get it. And he would work with whoever he needed to get the NHS done. And I would do the same. And I hope we would all do the same. And when this pandemic is over, because at the moment, certainly as a county councillor, you know, I'm working with my Conservative colleagues and my Liberal Democrat colleagues. I have to, because we all have to work together on this. And I believe that Keir Starmer is trying to do the same with the Tories in Westminster, you know, supporting them when they're doing the right thing. I think it's a lot easier in local government because, generally speaking, whichever party is in power in local government, they're generally doing the right thing. I think Sir Keir's having a much harder time of it than me because the government would just seem to be completely shambolic. So when this is all over, what should we be fighting for? What would Nye be fighting for? Well, one of them very clearly, investment in social homes. Because a lot of what's going on, as I understand it, in Leicester City has to do with inadequacies of housing. We need an employment strategy that removes the perverse incentives that employers have through national insurance. It makes it cheaper for them to employ people under 16 hours minimum wage. That's not right. We need an employment strategy that puts unions right at the heart of health and safety so that workers are not exposed to unnecessary risks, more obvious now with COVID-19. We need a food strategy that tackles a food industry that relies for its profits on getting people addicted to salt and to sugar. Tom Watson, I think, was very passionate about this, and so am I. And we also need an integrated health and care service. We need to revisit the Oldham report and look again at how we would revitalise Nye Bevan's NHS and combine it with care so that we can be an NHS for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Terry. It's really valuable to hear from someone who spent much of their lives on the front line of the NHS and someone in Leicestershire where health is very much in mind at this time with the worrying news in Leicester City regarding the local lockdown. But everything that you've said, honestly, resonates with a lot of us on this call, understanding that we need a Labour government. We need a Labour government not only to keep on fighting for our NHS, but for housing, for employment, for families, for support services within our communities. It is imperative that we continue that fight. So no, thank you very much for your contribution this evening. And thank you to both of our speakers. But now it's over to our audience. So we've had a few questions come in. And please keep on sending the questions through. It is in the Q&A box just below. And also just to remind you that, again, we've got the donate link in the chat box as well, if you're interested in donating this evening. So our first question, we're going to try and do these questions live. So we've asked those that have submitted their questions if they're happy to jump on the video call and ask their questions themselves. And we've had a few people who are ready to do so. So our first question is from Mark Grayling from North East Derbyshire.
unmute myself. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Nick, for the talk. Thanks, Terry. Very, very, very interesting. My question's for Nick. You mentioned your meeting with Michael Foot, his 2-volume seminal work at the time. How does your take on Nye Bevan's life differ from Michael Foot's?
Well, it's interesting actually, and that's a very interesting question. For a start, one of the major, there's a few differences. I mean, I think that I would probably argue that mine is a bit more balanced. Michael was actually writing about someone that he knew. Michael was writing about somebody that he'd obviously spent a great deal of time with. So I was writing at more of a distance. But I was also lucky in terms of having additional papers that just weren't available to Michael. I mean, I'm very lucky to be a very good relationship with the Bevan family. There's a new edition actually of Bevan's In Place of Fear, which is coming out in the next few months, which I was very honoured to write the introduction to. But the reason I raise that is because the Bevan family gave me a lot of papers, Nye's personal papers, that just weren't available to Michael. So it allowed me to, if you like, produce a more rounded picture. Simply not a criticism of Michael, who's a fantastic writer of whom I'm a great fan, but simply because that information wasn't available to him. So I guess the differences are a bit more balanced. I can write from a longer perspective. I can write from, the 2014 when it was published. Michael was far closer to events. And third, it has a lot more information in it that wasn't available to Michael. But obviously the other point, and it goes back to my original conversation with Michael, my aim was to supplement what Michael did. It wasn't to contradict Michael in any way. It was to take Michael's positive case for Nye Bevan, which I totally agree with, but to use the new evidence to take that message to a new generation. And that's what I sought to do with the book.
Thank you. Mark, did you get your answer?
Yeah,
are you happy?
Yeah. You just sold a book there, Nick, as well.
It's a very good book. I'm reading it. It's very good.
Well, not to worry, actually, we'll be circulating the link for that as well after this call. But we also now have another question from Mary from Charnwood. Just a couple of moments for Mary to connect.
Slow, very slow. Okay. This is a really silly question, by the way, which is, what do you think Nye would have said about Boris?
Oh, you could guarantee he'd have said something amazingly clever and rude. I'm sure Nick will have a good one.
Well, he once said this about a different Tory Prime Minister, but I think it might well apply to Boris Johnson as well. He said that this particular Tory Prime Minister had a real gift for putting flamboyant labels on empty luggage. And I think that might just about sum up a number of things that Boris Johnson does on a regular basis. But I cannot but imagine what exactly an Nye Bevan would have thought of Boris Johnson. But Nye wrote a book in 1944, a quite short book called Why Not Trust the Tories. Have a look at that book, and everything he says in it that's wrong about the Tories is, I'm afraid to say, exemplified in the current Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, no, thank you, Mary, for your question. We also now have another question. So we have a question from Rory Palmer from Leicester. He should be also joining shortly.
I know. Hi, Rory.
Hi.
How are you?
Hi, Rory.
Hi, Nick, Terry. Great opening contributions from both of you. Thank you very much. My question is about social care, because of course in 1948, it wasn't just about the NHS, it was about the National Assistance Act, the start of the social care system, if you like. And I'm interested, Nick and Terry, in your reflections on what do I think Bevan would have made of the way the NHS and social care have probably now become far too separate and too far apart. What would he do about that? And how do we make sure that this moment coming out of this terrible pandemic is the moment that we once and for all reach a new settlement which brings the NHS and social care to a fully integrated position, much closer together, much better for the people and families who need that system to be properly integrated.
If we start with Terry.
Well, I think, you know, I think it's difficult when you've got a historical figure, and we can imagine him being so much wiser and braver than the rest of us. But he wouldn't have, the facts that were before him and were before all of us, probably before the 1960s, were that the NHS was working fine. And we had a health system that was there to pick up the pieces when people had an acute illness and to get them better. And in a kind of life trajectory, if we kind of draw a sort of line starting here, we all start off jolly healthy, and then we all kind of come to a sort of midpoint in our lives, and then we might have dips, and we get better with the NHS, and another dip, and then eventually we die. Well, that's how it used to be, and most people would be dead sort of shortly after retiring at about 70, and that was very efficient from the point of view of an economy, and I'm sure the Tories would approve. But that's not how it is now. We have an NHS that has successfully extended people's life expectancy. Unfortunately, it hasn't extended their healthy life expectancy. So we've now got this period beyond 65, 70, which can extend up to 90, when people put an increasing demand on health and social care. And it is at this point that having a separate health and social care system clearly doesn't work. I would like to imagine, because Nye was such a bright and sensible man, that he would have grasped this nettle a long time ago, and we should have grasped it. Oh my goodness, we all knew this was going on over 10 years ago. And what have we done but faff around? And I don't think Nye Bevan was a faff arounder. And the things that have been said by people like Andy Burnham and the Oldham Report and the Silver Book team in Leicester, he would have done something about it. What do you think, Nick?
Yes, and just really to follow on from what Terry has said there, I think first of all, one of the reasons we have this crisis in social care is the success of the National Health Service, because the National Health Service has been a huge part in why people live a lot longer. But of course, what that's done is brought a series of other issues into play, and a very, Terry spoke about the difference between the challenge of the 1940s, when it was infectious diseases like tuberculosis, and the view that Bevan and others had at the time that what you had to do was catch these diseases early, you had to treat them early, and this was part of what the NHS was. What we have now are challenges, I think, around longer term conditions. I'm thinking, for example, of dementia. There's a good example of one where sadly more and more people are suffering from it. Now, what then we get to is what you do about it. And it seems to me that social care has been in the too difficult box for too long in terms of how you deal with it. Now, I'm speaking to you from Wales, where here in Wales, the belief, which I do think it's a consensus across the Labour movement, I don't think it's contentious, that we desperately need the two things to come together, that we need the two things to be recognised as codependent. I think it's what we want to do. It's what we're doing here in government in Wales and what we need to do around the country. And I also think it will become an ever more increasing issue. We know that the government in the UK government in terms of England did not throw a protective ring around care homes as it claims to have done in this global pandemic, and most definitely didn't. But it also shows to us the linkage between the two, when you have people from hospital discharged into care homes, and you need adequate care for people in old age. And for me, of course, the world is very different. I'm not suggesting the world isn't very different from 1948. Of course it is. But I think it's still taking that same set of principles about care being based upon what people need and putting it very firmly into the social care sector, and then making sure that health and social care are knitted together in absolutely the way that they should be.
Yeah, great.
No, thank you. Thank you, Nick. And thank you very much, Rory, for your question. The next question we have is from Austin Brady. He should be with us shortly. also just to highlight that we have a few more questions. We will try to get through as many as we can,
Yeah.
but obviously time is not on our side. Austin, are you there?
Still walking to the podium.
Now there we are.
Okay, I will move to the next question. We might be having some technical difficulties. Maybe we will come back to Austin's question. We've also got Pauline Inwood from Mid Derbyshire. Pauline might also be making her way to the podium. Hopefully we will hear from her soon.
I think I'm here.
Wonderful, yes. We
I
can
can't
hear
see my video there. I don't know why my video is not there. Do you need my video? Oh, hang on, start video. There we go.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so
Hello.
much, Pauline.
Hi.
Hi.
They were brilliant talks. I really, really enjoyed them. Talking about, though, things that are different now from something that Nye Bevan probably didn't have to think about much at all, was what the state of the environment around us is that the health service has to cope with. I'd like to hear your thoughts about how much we can integrate as we think about what has to happen with health and social care, how we can integrate that with what we also has to happen around green issues, thinking about how pollution is causing more deaths through COVID, for example. I mean, there's obviously a lot more than that, but that's just one example. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much for your question, Pauline. Shall I start with Terry?
I think the biggest risk, Pauline, and this is an important question, is that we might forget about the importance of the environment with COVID. In some ways, the COVID-19 virus is bringing us some very strong messages. It's made it quite clear that if only we would all stop rushing around in our cars and consuming so much, the environment would be better. People have noticed more wildlife in their gardens. The air has been clearer. This is an opportunity to sit back and go, hang on, why don't we make things better? The fact that we're having this meeting now, today, online, and none of us have had to drive anywhere to get here. Shows that there are things that we perhaps should have been doing 10 years ago to save the environment, and we just didn't because, well, we didn't understand technology and it was all too difficult. And then there's the real risk is that what recovery will mean, particularly with the Conservatives in power, is we've got Johnson going, build, build, build. Oh, heaven help us. Which, building one's way out of an economic crisis is a well-known economic strategy. It has some advantages, but it just depends what you're building and why you're building it and where you're building it and how you're building it. This is a major opportunity to have another look at what we build and how we build it. Do we continue using old-fashioned building technology, or do we really grasp some of the new things that we could be doing to have a truly green economy, that we could have houses that barely need to use any outsourced fuel at all and keep people warm and dry? This could be a major opportunity if we grasp it. I'm just not convinced that the current government will grasp anything other than a brown envelope under the table.
Yeah.
And your thoughts, Nick?
Thank you, Pauline. I think that's such an important question. You're absolutely right that the way politics and the way environmental issues were understood, if at all, is obviously very different now to how it was then. But one thing Nye Bevan did understand, and I think Terry summed it up in a really powerful line in her speech when she said that healthcare is about much more than medicine. And it absolutely is. And Nye understood it in terms of housing, for example. He made that famous comment. He said that rabbit warren housing leads to a rabbit warren mind, and the kind of houses that he wanted to build and did build in the 1950s had things like, inside toilets, which we all take for granted now, and things like making sure there were separate rooms for people to bath and all kind of things that we've now taken for granted, but were about people's lived environment and the quality of it. Now, in terms of today, things like air quality is absolutely vital to people's health. The amount of pollution, whether it's in the atmosphere, whether it's in water, whether it's in other things, is absolutely vital to how healthy people are. So the environment that we exist in, housing obviously being very important, but the air we walk around in, all these things are absolutely crucial and to well-being. And it's so important that we see these things as interlinked. And I totally agree with what Terry says about this, that I think people have been forced into changing their life patterns. We've had to do it because of the global pandemic. But, you know, we were, as Terry said about this particular meeting, I'm sure that if we'd met together, lovely though it would have been, some people would have come on public transport, some people might have been close enough to walk, some people would have driven. All that would have happened, but hasn't happened because of the way that we've actually managed to meet. And I think that it is so important going forward as we make this case to Build Back Better, as we make this case for how we remake the economy, we firstly have to say things cannot just go back to the status quo, they can't go back to how they were, but also to make this point that, where are the jobs of the future? The jobs of the future are green jobs. That's where the jobs of the future are. And I think we have to be making this case very, very powerfully as we recover from this pandemic, that the environment must be at the heart of what we do. I mean, I was one of those who voted in Parliament prior to the last election for a climate emergency. I can tell you, of course, there's been the global pandemic, and I appreciate that. But since then, the Tories at Westminster do not behave in any sense as if there is a climate emergency. That's the thing, and that's the importance that we have to give to this going forward.
No, thank you very much, Nick, and thank you very much, Pauline, for your question. I will take 2 more questions and we'll try to get through them as quickly as possible, as we are now at 5 to 8. The time has literally flown by. So we'll try and get Austin Brady's question first.
Oh, hi. This question is really aimed at both Terry and Nick. Given that most people probably see the NHS as the place they go to fix them up if and when they fall ill, I appreciate people now are getting their heads around there's a lot more to do about the underlying causes of ill health and how this is linked to deprivation. But what do you think about the idea of using a universal basic income as a way of helping people to stay well? And could you see a universal basic income actually as a public health intervention?
Thank you very much for your question. We'll go to Nick first on this occasion.
I think that, I've written about this before, Austin, and various ideas on a universal basic income. I think at the moment, because we are calling at the moment for flexibility, and this, I think, is the immediacy of where we are as an opposition. So rather than arguing at the moment for one size fits all, what we've been arguing for is for flexibility. So take the furlough scheme. Clearly, some sectors of the economy are going to be far more adversely affected than others. So, Annalisa Dodds has been arguing for a different approach in different sectors. And secondly, to make sure that there are no cliff edges in support. So at this precise moment, what we're arguing for is something that is more flexible than universal. But it is something that I've written about in the past and I think is an interesting idea.
Thank you, Nick. And Terry?
Well, fortunately, this is above my pay grade because I'm only a county councillor, so I don't have to make this decision. But one of the things I do favour are universal services. And we look back, when my mum got child benefit when I was a kid, it was actually worth having. It was a decent chunk of money, and it helped her to keep 4 children clothed and fed in Birmingham on a toolmaker's wages. And I think that we forget how handy universal benefits are from the point of view of administration. There's an enormous amount of work goes into the complex set of benefits that we currently have, and administering it and fussing over people when they've got on universal credit and employment support allowance and personal independence payment and all of those different things, and you have to go and be checked up on, and which is so humiliating. Don't worry, I know about this. I have it in my family. So you think, yeah, there's a lot to be said for universal benefits, and then a robust system of taxation to make sure that people like me who don't actually need them pay them back. That would be my solution. I think Nye would probably like it, but he was a bit gung-ho as well.
Well, no, thank you very much, Terry, for your response, and thank you for your question, Austin. We will have another question just before we round up the evening. That's from Nutan Modi. I think you should be connected now. Hello?
Hello, it's Nita Modi here,
Hello.
chair of the list branch of the Co-op Party. And we've been talking about cooperative solutions for broken markets. And would you say, one, that the National Health Service was a broken market? And what do you think a cooperative solution might be to such a broken market?
I will ask Nick to start.
Do you mean, could I just check that, Nutan? Do you mean prior to the NHS existing, or do you mean the internal market that exists in England at the moment?
I mean the internal NHS market that exists at the moment. Would you say it was a broken market?
Yeah, I mean the fragmentation of the NHS in England, I think, is a real problem. And, you know, I've said that for a number of years, and I contrast it with the situation here in Wales, where obviously the Welsh government has taken a very different direction. I think it's one of the supreme ironies that Nye Bevan in his own lifetime never liked devolution very much, but strangely it's devolution that's actually led to his model of the National Health Service being preserved in a much better way. And I think that therefore, so in terms of the solution to it, it's the solution that we have here in Wales, where we do work right across the healthcare sector with government at the heart of it to try, and, you know, we have a fine cooperative movement here in Wales, which is working in a number of sectors too. But that collaborative approach that the Welsh government takes is what I think is a far better solution than marketisation and competition, which you see in England.
Thank you very much, Nick. And anything you'd like to add, Terry?
Well, I mean, I was in my first attempt at being a GP when the purchase provider split came in. At that point, I fled from general practice, and because I didn't fancy all of that unnecessary bureaucracy, spent 12 years in psychiatry instead, and came back just in time for the Health and Social Care Act to come in and mess things about. But what is fascinating is the way the Tories constantly try to bring marketisation into the NHS. And what has been really interesting to watch, particularly with the stupidity of the Health and Social Care Act, is how the health professionals, the clinicians, have quietly and behind the scenes tended to resist all of this because we know it's stupid. It just doesn't work. And that, so is it broken markets? That sounds like a bit of technical language that I'm not sure I understand, but I do know that a market way of running the NHS has never worked during my professional career, and it really it's well known, I think, in the behind the scenes clinicians and managers that we're all trying very hard to ignore the Health and Social Care Act and pull it all together, because it has to be. It has to be one system.
No, thank you very much, Terry, and thank you for your question, Nutan. So it's in my gift to get the last question. So I thought that was going to be the last one, but no, I have got one more question for our speakers. And I apologize for those that are still on the call and probably have to get off to do something else. We have run over a little bit, but hopefully this last question will be as quick as possible. We have Debbie O'Hara as the next and last question for the evening. Sorry, so we just wait a couple of moments. Hopefully Debbie will be on the call. Here I was thinking it was in my gift to have a last question. It might not be in my gift anymore.
Run away.
Okay, well, if that is the last question and we can't seem to get a hold of Debbie, what I will do is proceed to end the evening. So we've had some great questions this evening, and thank you to our audience for attending and submitting your questions. I'm really sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. We did try. I did try to swing in one last question, but for whatever reason, whether it be technology, we couldn't get that last question. But thank you for those that contributed. I'd also like to say, once again, thank you to our superb guest speakers. Nick, thank you so much for your time this evening and for giving such a brilliant talk on Labour hero Nye Bevan. It'll be great to see you in our region, hopefully sometime soon when that option becomes available again to us all. Terry, thank you also for joining us this evening and giving real insight into working within the NHS and fighting for your residents and standing for Labour as well as a local councillor. Thank you so much. Again, many thanks to the East Midlands Labour Party for organising this event. We really hope you enjoyed it, and remember that this is a fundraiser, so if you have enjoyed it, please do donate on the link in the chat box. We just want to say, a great thank you to all those that joined in. You'll shortly receive an email from the East Midlands team with a feedback form. Please do take a couple of minutes to fill in that form. Your thoughts, your views are really valuable to the team and how we'll shape the next events coming up in lieu of the fact that we can't meet in person. Lastly, if you also would like a copy of Nick's book, which I would as well, on Labour hero Nye Bevans, the link will be included on the email as I mentioned earlier. So thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you all again soon. Please take care of yourselves and each other. Enjoy the rest of your evening and have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.